Good morning, Neil. Hope you're well. And noticed that you've written a piece with various scenarios as to the path going forward and commenting on the potential risks for Fed errors in terms of policy. And I'd like you to run me through it if you can.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Simon. Well, I think there is a risk for an accident brewing here, in my opinion. When you think about the potential scenarios, they largely fall on similar lines, right? I mean, growth can be steady, inflation slows, growth can be slowing, and inflation slows. I think those are, call it the soft landing and the softer landing. Now, in both of those scenarios, you'd expect fixed income to rally. You wouldn't expect equities to rally if growth is also slowing. Um, but I think those are the two scenarios with the highest probabilities. Now, if you think about growth slowing and inflation reaccelerating, the so-called stagflation scenario, I mean, that's a kind of a stretch because productivity is fine. So usually you see a lot weaker productivity growth in stagflationary environments. That's not what we have right now. And the last one, of course, is the return to boomflation. Kind of what we saw last year. I think the odds of that are also quite limited. So I still think that the risk of the first, growth steady, inflation slowing, is much higher than the risk of growth slowing and inflation slowing. But I think that's almost beside the point. In either scenario, bonds will work, and so I think that if you had to pick something, that's probably the one that you'd pick. Now, in terms of the Fed, I think it's worth pointing out that nominal growth is already running below the rate of the overnight Fed funds rate, right? I mean, so historically, that is a harbinger or a reflection of tight monetary policy. And when you look through the details of the economy, I mean, we know that housing is slowing. It added a lot to GDP in Q1. It won't be adding at all in the second quarter. Consumer spending is going to have a more challenging time because real incomes have come under some pressure. So maybe the savings rate goes up a little bit. So, consumers will still be spending money, but it won't be at the pace, I don't think, that we've seen in recent quarters. So, so growth is moderating. Nothing to light your hair on fire about, but it is moderating from the 3% pace that we saw last year. But more importantly, inflation's moderating. So, you're going to see a weaker nominal growth environment going forward. And I think that's important to point out because the Fed has been highly reflexive to the data as it's been coming in. And so there's a chance here that they kind of look offsides, relative to the data, because the data can shift around quickly. So it was very hawkish. The data were hawkish in Q1, and the Fed has kind of responded in kind. Now, if they stay hawkish in the second and third quarter as the data slows, that could create problems. And with that in mind, I mean, think about what this means potentially for the next Fed meeting, right? You could easily see a scenario where the Fed is simply marking to market their forecasts. And we were very close in March to 2 cuts. We stayed at 3, but now you can easily see a scenario where the Fed takes the median dot just to 1 cut. If that's going to happen just as inflation is moderating, then, I mean, the Fed could, again, look a little bit offside. So, to me, it sort of lends support to this idea that, you'd expect bonds to do well, because if the Fed is sounding more hawkish relative to the way what the data justify, that ultimately creates almost like a braking mechanism in a sense, if that makes sense. So, you kind of hit peak hawkishness, and then interest rates start to fall because the markets kind of understand that the Fed's overdoing it here. So I think that's sort of the risk that I think that's kind of flaring out. I think that's certainly something to be thinking about, going forward.
That's great, especially as we look towards the Fed next week. So I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Simon.